coffee in a gas station cup, sun coming up in my dash, mud on these worn out boots, paste up folded in the cash.
You know, if you stand on the street and look up at a massive skyscraper, it just, it looks like this solid, inevitable monolith, right? Like glass and steel. It's imposing.
Oh, absolutely.
It reflects the sky. And you really don't think about the rebar or the concrete poured deep into the bedrock or, the hidden structural engineering that keeps the wind from just knocking the whole thing over.
Right, because the architecture is completely invisible to the people walking by on the sidewalk. All you see is the polished exterior, the way it catches the light.
Exactly. And if you go inside, maybe you see marble lobbies, high-speed elevators, and it all feels incredibly robust, like so permanent, so undeniably successful.
Yeah.
But what happens when someone on the inside starts looking at the blueprint? What happens when they realize that those load-bearing walls aren't designed to support life, but to trap it?
That is the pivotal question.
Welcome, everyone. I am so glad you are here with us today. You're listening to the fourth installment of our special documentary series, Agora Talks, Voices After Silence. And if you've been on this journey with us, you know we've been deep in the trenches of some profoundly heavy human experiences.
We really have. We have been tracing the contours of lives that were fundamentally reshaped by their devotion to a single institution.
And just for a quick context check here, because it is vital to ground ourselves before we step into this deep dive builds directly on the foundational testimonies we explored in parts 2 and 3.
Yes, and I highly recommend that if you haven't heard those earlier discussions on the Agora Talks channel, you take some time to do so.
Right, because in the second part, we looked at the powerful pseudonymous testimony called My Life, which was written by a man who gave 20 years of his youth and adulthood to Opus Dei as a Numerary.
And then in the third part, we broke down that harrowing memoir, Beyond the Threshold, by María del Carmen Tapia, who was a woman who spent 18 years in the highest echelons of the exact same organization.
But today's mission, and I want to be clear about this to everyone listening, today's mission is entirely new. We are not just retelling their stories. We are placing their lives under a comparative microscope.
Exactly. We want to see what happens when you lay these two very specific experiences side by side.
Yeah, so I'll quickly reintroduce our two primary sources for you listening right now. Source A is the author of My Life. He was recruited in Spain in the late 1980s or early 90s, and he was targeted as a young boy, barely 14.
Right, groomed for leadership from adolescence.
Groomed, yes. Sent to Rome, deployed internationally as a high-ranking regional defender to a country where he had to learn a completely new language. And he finally left after 2 decades in 2011.
And then we have source B, María del Carmen Tapia. Now, her experience took place decades earlier. She was a highly educated professional woman recruited in post-Civil War Spain in 1948.
A completely different era.
Completely. And she rose to the absolute highest ranks of the women's branch in Rome, worked directly with the founder, José María Escrivá, directed the entire region of Venezuela, and then narrowly escaped after 18 years.
So at first glance, these are entirely different lives. They were separated by decades of time, by gender, by geography, by entirely different eras of the Catholic Church.
And totally different recruitment styles.
Right. Yet, when you analyze their testimonies together, they reveal a terrifyingly identical underlying architecture, different lives, same machinery.
That is the exact analytical bridge we are building today. But before we cross it, I need to firmly and clearly establish our editorial boundaries here because this is crucial to the whole mission of Agora Talks.
Please do.
This deep dive is an analytical, historically aware, and psychologically intelligent documentary essay. It is not an attack on faith.
Absolutely not.
It is not a condemnation of ordinary Catholic believers, nor is it a rejection of the concept of religious vocation.
Yeah.
What we are examining here is institutional totalism.
The actual mechanics of it.
Right. We are looking at the mechanics of a high-control system that operates behind the veil of religious idealism. We're attempting to understand, through their own written accounts, how human psychology can be captured, managed, and ultimately consumed by an institution.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if their backgrounds, their eras, and even their genders created entirely different experiences on the surface, how do we even begin to compare them structurally? How do you logically compare a 14-year-old boy in the late 20th century to a professional woman in 1948?
Well, we do it by looking past the specific events and focusing intensely on the structural mechanisms.
Okay.
Because both of these individuals became intensely trusted members. Both of them served in the central headquarters in Rome. Both were sent abroad to govern and manage regions on behalf of the institution.
So the trajectory is actually the same.
Yes. So we are going to trace the parallel tracks of their psychological capture, their agonizing awakening, and their eventual extraction. We're looking for the operational mechanics that function regardless of who the target is.
I want to start right at the beginning, at the recruitment phase. Because any machine needs raw materials to function, right?
Absolutely.
And what strikes me in both of these accounts is how this machinery acquires its components by adapting its approach specifically to the target it wants to consume. Like, let's look at María del Carmen Tapia first. She wasn't some lost soul looking for an anchor in a chaotic world, was she?
Not at all. In 1948, Tapia was a highly educated, independent professional.
Yeah.
And we really have to contextualize this. Spain in the 1940s, right after the Civil War, was an incredibly restrictive environment for women.
Extremely conservative.
Yes. Yet here is Tapia working at the Spanish National Research Council for an intellectual journal called Arbor. She was engaged to be married, she was socially active, deeply curious, and she actually possessed her own suspicions about Opus Dei before she ever joined.
Wait, what kind of suspicions?
Well, she had heard rumors circulating in Madrid about their manipulative tactics. People in her circles were referring to them as white masonry.
White masonry. What does that actually mean in the context of 1940s Spain?
It's a fascinating term. In traditional Catholic Spain, Freemasonry was viewed as this secretive, powerful, subversive network operating in the shadows to control society.
Okay.
So by calling Opus Dei white masonry, critics were essentially saying they use the exact same secretive, elitist, network-driven tactics as the Freemasons, but they paint it white, meaning they claim to do it in the name of the Catholic Church.
I see.
And Tapia was aware of this reputation. She was very skeptical.
So how does an organization overcome the defenses of a skeptical, highly educated woman who is already engaged to be married? That seems impossible.
It bypasses her intellectual defenses by using a figure of immense respect. Tapia actually confronted her boss about those exact rumors, and her boss happened to be Dr. Raimundo Panikkar.
Okay, and who was he?
He was a brilliant academic, polyglot, a man who wrote complex treatises on quantum physics and the plurality of world religions. He commanded immense respect in the academic community. And Panikkar didn't approach her with dogma or a list of restrictive rules.
He didn't just preach at her.
No. According to her account, he calmly dismissed the rumors as calumnies, framing them as the inevitable misunderstandings that plague any genuinely holy endeavor.
Wow. That's a very clever reframing. It basically turns criticism into proof of holiness.
Exactly. And from there, he slowly, methodically morphed from being her academic superior to becoming her spiritual director. He leveraged her profound respect for his mind into a position of absolute spiritual authority over her life.
And this all culminates in a highly engineered event, doesn't it? The text refers to it as a vocational crisis.
Yeah.
Can you break down what actually happened at that retreat?
Right, so Tapia is invited to a spiritual retreat at a residence called Zurbaran. She's away from her fiancé, away from her family, and placed in an environment of total silence.
Complete isolation.
Exactly. And Panikkar, knowing her engaged status is the final barrier, uses emotional manipulation. He doesn't preach theology. He reads her a poem by Oscar Wilde, The Nightingale and the Rose.
The one about the bird bleeding itself dry against a thorn?
Yes. The bird sacrifices its own life, pressing its heart against a thorn, just to create a red rose for a young student who ultimately just tosses it in the gutter.
Such a tragic image.
And Panikkar uses that highly evocative imagery to instill a crushing sense of guilt in Tapia. He essentially frames her choice as either destroying her fiancé's heart, like the thorn, or cowardly rejecting God's ultimate sacrifice.
He traps her emotionally?
Yes. He forces a sudden, life-altering commitment out of her while she is in an emotionally heightened, completely isolated state. The intellect was bypassed through academic respect, and the will was broken through manufactured guilt.
It's stunning and honestly terrifying. Now, I want to pivot to our male Numerary because his recruitment couldn't look more different on the surface. I mean, we're talking about a completely different era and a totally different target.
We are. He was targeted before he even turned 14. He wasn't a professional dealing with academic giants. He was just a kid hanging out at an Opus Dei youth club in the late 1980s or 90s.
Just a normal teenager.
Right. The text describes him as a typical club kid, nice, well-integrated, looking for activities and friendship.
So instead of breaking down a pre-existing adult life, like Panikkar did with Tapia's career and her engagement, how did they approach the boy?
Well, the system recognized that he didn't have an established identity to dismantle, so they built his foundational identity from scratch.
They just wrote the code themselves.
Exactly. A Numerary spent hours and hours with him. The author mentions 2 specific conversations lasting over an hour each, dedicated solely to convincing a 13-year-old boy that he had a lifelong divine vocation as a Numerary.
Just to pause here and make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly does taking a vocation as a Numerary entail? Like, what are they asking this kid to do?
A Numerary is a celibate member of Opus Dei. They live in centers run by the organization, they hand over their entire salary to the institution, and they commit to strict schedules of prayer and apostolic work while still holding secular jobs in society.
That is a massive, life-encompassing commitment.
And they were pitching this to a 13-year-old.
And then they pull this brilliant psychological trick on the kid, don't they?
Yeah.
He agrees, but they don't just let him in right away.
Right. Because he wasn't 14 yet, which is the absolute minimum age to even ask for admission, they told him he had to wait more than 7 months just to write the letter asking to become an aspirant.
Artificial scarcity. It's like a highly sophisticated computer virus. It doesn't use the same code for every machine, right? It scans your specific operating system to find the unique vulnerability.
That's a great way to put it.
Like for Tapia, it was her idealism and her respect for a brilliant adult mentor. For the boy, it was the adolescent desire to be special, to have a definitive, heroic path.
And the waiting period is a classic compliance technique. They made him sit on a waiting list for 7 months. During that time, he wasn't questioning the decision. He was actively practicing being the boy who was waiting to give his life to God.
He was convincing himself.
Yes, he was hardening the cement of his own capture. The perceived value of the commitment skyrocketed because he was told he couldn't have it yet.
So what we see here is that despite these completely opposite methods, the result was identical. Vocation becomes identity. The individual's personal desires, whether it's Tapia wanting to get married and run a journal, or the boy just wanting to be a normal teenager exploring the world, are systematically replaced by absolute institutional availability.
The person begins to cease existing outside of their function within the machine.
Which brings us to a crucial pivot point in their stories. Because once the institution has captured the identity, how does it maintain it over decades? I mean, how do you keep a brilliant woman and a highly capable young man compliant, especially when they are intelligent, observant people?
You have to redefine their understanding of virtue. You spiritualize their surrender. The everyday compliance of these individuals is transformed into a theological absolute.
Let's dig into this weaponization of obedience, because this seems central to the whole thing.
This is perhaps the cornerstone of ideological totalism. The institution systematically conflates the voice of the director with the voice of God. The members are taught that their own intuition, their own conscience, is inherently flawed, selfish, and proud.
So you can't trust yourself at all.
Exactly. According to this framework, the highest moral expression of your existence is simply to obey the hierarchy. But obedience should not mean annihilation. True spiritual obedience in any healthy religious tradition requires a functioning conscience, not the destruction of it.
Obedience should not mean annihilation. That is the heart of it right there. Let's look at how the male Numerary lived this out, because he writes about being bounced between cities 3 times in 5 months when he was just 21 years old.
Yes, sir.
I mean, think about the stress of moving 3 times in 5 months for a normal adult, let alone someone trying to settle.
And he didn't complain once. He was studying for 2 university degrees simultaneously, and he dropped one of them completely.
Just walked away from it.
Yes. Why? Because he was suddenly handed a role running a local center, and he had to give all his time to the institution. His personal academic goals meant absolutely nothing compared to the immediate administrative needs of the center. The institution tested his compliance, and his reflex was pure surrender.
It gets even more pronounced when he's sent to Rome. He actually explicitly asked not to go to the headquarters, didn't he?
He did. He saw that he fit the profile for a headquarters bureaucrat. He was young, Spanish, experienced in internal governance, and he had a reputation for being ready for anything. But he dreaded the environment in Rome.
Why did he dread it?
From what he knew, he felt it lacked the warmth of a true spiritual family. It was a cold administrative hub. So he took a risk and asked his superiors to keep him out of it.
And their response? Did they listen?
A month later, they informed him he was being sent to Rome to live at Villa Tavere. They didn't ask him. They informed him. And this is where the psychological conditioning shows its absolute power. Because his will was so thoroughly atrophied, he didn't fight it. He packed his bags with his best smile, convincing his own silenced conscience that this must be God's perfect plan simply because it came from the directors. He rationalized his own defeat.
Tapia's experience of this annihilation was arguably even more visceral, because once she was fully inside, she witnessed this horrifying physical consumption of the women. I want to talk about the boiling oil incident.
Yes.
Because it is just, it's completely seared into my brain as a metaphor for what you're describing.
It is one of the most disturbing anecdotes in her entire memoir, and it speaks volumes about the internal culture. It involves a woman named Sabina. Sabina worked in the administration. And we need to define that. The administration in this context is essentially the domestic servitude branch for the women.
Right.
Their sole job is cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the physical spaces for the men's centers, always remaining entirely invisible to the men they serve.
Invisible, silent perfection.
Exactly. Sabina was frantically trying to keep up with the exhausting, rigid schedule of serving the men's dining room. She was under so much pressure not to delay the meal by even a single minute that she made a desperate maneuver in the kitchen and dropped a massive pan of boiling oil down her own leg.
She suffered agonizing, severe burns, didn't she?
Yes. And the core tragedy here is why it happened. It happened because the institution demanded absolute adherence to the schedule. Her physical safety, her human limit was entirely secondary.
That's horrifying.
She was literally more terrified of the moral failure of being late with a meal than she was of the physical danger of the kitchen.
And Tapia uses that anecdote to symbolize the complete consumption of the woman's identity and well-being. It's total physical consumption to fuel the machinery, and the psychological consumption matched it perfectly, right?
Oh, absolutely. Tapia details how her personal mail was routinely read. She talks about receiving magazines that had been censored by the directors.
Wait, like actual pages torn out?
Literally torn out before she was allowed to read them. As if a grown, educated woman couldn't be trusted with secular images. It is the complete destruction of personal boundaries.
And a massive part of that boundary destruction involves severing ties with the outside world, most crucially, the biological family. The mechanism at play here is monopolizing emotional attachment, right?
Precisely. If family bonds are strong, the biological family remains a competitor for the member's loyalty. If you love your parents more than you trust the directors, the institution has lost its absolute control.
This part is so hard to grasp for anyone outside the system. Tapia wasn't allowed to visit her family in Madrid for nearly 2 decades. 2 decades. She lived in the same country for a good portion of that time.
Yes.
Her brother literally had to sneak a visit, subverting the directors, just to see her face.
And it becomes even darker when grief is involved. When Tapia's uncle died, a man she loved dearly, the institution weaponized that grief. According to her memoir, they wouldn't let her process it naturally. They wouldn't let her grieve with her family.
What did they tell her to do?
They told her to stop complaining and just offer it up. They utilized the raw, unprocessed pain to force a deeper emotional detachment from her relatives. The pain became a tool to further isolate her and bind her tighter to the group.
The male Numerary had a similar emotional severing. He noted in his testimony that he literally did not cry for 20 years. Let that sink in for everyone listening. 2 decades of human life, through all the stress, the moves, the demands, without a single tear.
He describes it as his heart having rusted under the guise of supernatural detachment. He had trained himself so thoroughly to see everything with God's eyes, to accept every single hardship as a divine dictate, that he suppressed all normal human emotion.
He just shut it down.
He had essentially exchanged his heart for perfect compliance.
He writes about a moment, right as he's finally waking up to the reality of his situation after 20 years, where he hugs his mother in a cafe. And his mother tells him, with tears in her eyes, that he had never hugged her like that in his entire life.
It's heartbreaking.
He realized in that moment that his heart was finally waking up from a 20-year coma.
That emotional atrophy is the devastating human cost of this machinery. And we haven't even touched on the material cost yet. Both of these individuals experienced a total financial and professional hijacking. All their labor, all their intellectual output, all their money was redirected to fuel the system.
Right. Tapia's professional labor was entirely consumed. She wasn't earning a salary for herself or building a resume for her own future. She was building their empire. directing regions in Venezuela, setting up schools that served as recruitment fronts, managing hundreds of people.
And the male Numerary handed over every cent of his salary for 20 years. He gave up his professional trajectory as a teacher, taking 10 years to finally get a part-time teaching job for just a few hours a week because his internal duties always came first.
He later wrote that he realized he had been treated like a chess piece, right? And the most glaring example of this was his potential ordination as a priest.
Yes, the ordination is key.
Let's explore that, because becoming a priest is a massive sacred life choice. How did the institution handle his ordination?
They kept him dangling. He spent years in Rome studying theology, continually being told to remain available to be ordained. But they explicitly told him that studying at the Roman college didn't guarantee ordination.
So he was just on standby.
They asked him to be ready to say yes when they needed a priest, but also to be perfectly ready for them to never call him. His personal desire to serve the church as a priest was totally secondary to the institution's administrative convenience.
That's so manipulative.
He realized his own opinion only counted once the directors had already decided what they believed God's will was for him.
Okay, I want to step in here and play devil's advocate on behalf of a skeptical listener. We are describing extreme sacrifice. But both of these people joined voluntarily. No one forced them at gunpoint. Doesn't every intense religious order demand extreme sacrifice?
That's a fair question.
I mean, Carmelites take vows of poverty and cloister. Trappist monks take vows of silence and give up all their money. How is what Tapia and the Numerary experienced any different from standard Catholic religious asceticism?
That is an essential question to ask, and it gets to the very core of institutional deception. The crucial difference, the thing that makes this an adaptive trap rather than a transparent religious vow, is the bait and switch.
The bait and switch.
Yes. This organization specifically sold itself to these people as a secular calling. The entire premise, their main public relations claim to the outside world, was about sanctifying ordinary work in the middle of the modern world. They tell you, you don't wear a habit, you wear civilian clothes. You work in a secular lab, a university, or a law firm. You are supposed to be an ordinary citizen.
But internally, what was it like internally?
Internally, the reality they experienced operated exactly like a cloistered totalist prison, but without the honesty of a convent's walls. A Carmelite nun knows exactly what she is signing up for. The cloister is literal, visible, and canonically transparent.
Right, you can see the walls.
Tapia and the Numerary were told they were staying the world, only to have the world systematically erased from their lives. Their mail was read, their movements controlled, their money confiscated, their family ties severed. They were promised the world and given a cage. The secular vocation was an illusion.
That distinction changes everything. And eventually, both of our subjects ended up in the very center of that cage. They both reached the global headquarters in Rome, Villa Tevere for the men, Villa Sacchetti for the women. And this is where the grand illusion of the spiritual family collides head-on with cold corporate reality.
Because if you look at the history of ideological movements, the headquarters is always where the rhetoric is manufactured. But inherently, it is also where the hypocrisy is most acutely visible to the people who work there. It's where the curtain is pulled back.
Let's talk about the stark contrast of wealth and poverty that Tapia witnessed. Because she arrived in Rome from Spain in the early 1950s. She knew that back in Spain, the women in the organization were living in brutal austerity.
Complete poverty.
They barely had money for basic food. They were freezing in poorly heated centers, making do with absolutely nothing, and constantly told to joyfully offer up their physical suffering for the good of the work. And then she walks into this sprawling, opulent Roman complex.
We are talking about an immaculately funded complex with 14 different lavishly decorated chapels, miles of polished corridors, luxury apartments, and personal maids for the founder.
It's jarring.
Tapia realized that Escrivá was living a life thoroughly insulated by extreme wealth, influence, and untouchable power. She noted he even had a pet dog, which seems trivial, but within a system where members are forbidden from having personal attachments or luxuries, a pet was a jarring flex of privilege that completely contradicted the rigid asceticism demanded of everyone else.
So Tapia sees the material hypocrisy. The male Numerary, arriving decades later, sees the administrative callousness. He was assigned to work in the St. Michael's department.
Right. St. Michael's is essentially the central nervous system that manages numeraries globally. He was handed the keys to the control room.
And he was reading the reports, signing the documents that dictated people's lives all over the world. What did he realize from that vantage point?
He saw firsthand that the sheer bureaucratic callousness was staggering. He realized that life-altering decisions regarding members were unilateral. They were totally disconnected from human empathy or pastoral care.
Just a numbers game.
Exactly. The leadership didn't care about an individual's happiness, their burnout, or their personal struggles. They only cared about maintaining the machinery, filling the posts, and keeping the numbers looking good on paper.
Which brings us to a really painful process for both of them, the demystification of leadership. Both Tapia and the Numerary witnessed the founder, Jose Maria Escrivá, up close. Yeah. And the reality of the man did not match the saintly myth they had been sold.
No, it did not.
Tapia's memoir paints a picture of blatant narcissism. The most chilling example is how he treated his own dying sister, Aunt Carmen.
According to Tapia's account, Aunt Carmen was dying of cancer in Rome. She desperately begged her brother to allow her to return to Spain so she could die peacefully in her homeland, surrounded by her native culture and extended family.
And Escrivá refused.
He flatly refused. Tapia states that he insisted she remain in Rome and told her she had to offer up her suffering for the good of the work.
He wouldn't let his own sister go home to die.
He prioritized the public optics of his organization, the centralized narrative of his power, and the presence of his family in the headquarters over the final, desperate, deeply human wish of his own dying sister. It is a chilling portrait of a man entirely consumed by the machinery of his own creation.
And the male Numerary experienced a similar demystification regarding the leadership's integrity, even after Escrivá's time. As we discussed with the ordination issue, he saw that the decisions weren't about discerning God's will, they were administrative chess moves.
Right.
He realized the directors would change his entire life plan without ever asking how he felt about it, simply because it suited the spreadsheet.
And here is the most crucial psychological turning point in both of their stories. Both of these subjects, who reached the absolute highest levels of power and trust within the organization, did not lose their faith in God.
That's a really important distinction.
They didn't leave because they wanted an easier life or because they wanted to break their vows to go party. They left because they realized that God wasn't in the machinery. They realized the institution was operating on raw power, bureaucracy, and deception, not on divine grace.
Yeah.
And because they were people of genuine integrity, their consciences finally rebelled. The crisis didn't happen because their conscience failed. It happened because their conscience was working exactly as it should.
Which is the most dangerous thing you can do in a totalist system.
Yeah.
How does an institution built on the premise of absolute divine perfection handle a high-ranking insider whose conscience suddenly wakes up and says, we have a structural problem?
It cannot handle it. A high control group cannot tolerate structural critique. It threatens the entire premise of their divine mandate. If the leaders are infallible and directed by God, then the structure cannot be flawed. When Tapia and the Numerary voiced their critiques, the institution's response was pure, terrifying pathologization and gaslighting.
Let's look at the male Numerary's crisis in detail. By this point, he is a regional defender. That is the highest lay position in the governance of the man in his entire region. He formally writes a letter to Rome declaring a crisis of conscience.
He lays it all out.
He outlines governance issues, a lack of charity, structural problems that he sees destroying people's lives in his region. He gives it to his regional vicar to fax to Rome. What does Rome do with this urgent plea from a senior leader?
First, they ignore him. They meet his agonizing plea for dialogue with total silence. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing. He is agonizing over his eternal soul, over his life's work, and they don't even acknowledge receipt of the letter.
So he writes a second, much harsher letter. He formally declares himself in crisis. He explicitly asks to be relieved of his governance posts because his conscience can no longer bear the weight of signing documents he knows are unjust. He's begging for a conversation about structural truth. When they finally respond, how do they handle it?
They don't invite him for a pastoral chat. They order him onto a plane immediately. He later finds out that the internal directive from Rome was essentially, let him come, and we'll see if he returns.
From his perspective, that sounds less like a spiritual retreat and more like a corporate emergency extraction.
It was threat management. They isolated the whistleblower to contain the threat to the region. He arrives in Rome expecting to discuss his letters, to have a deep theological and structural conversation to fix the profound problems he sees. Instead, he's subjected to the most bizarre love bombing and infantilization.
It's wild to read. They tell him to go play football on the new artificial grass pitch. They tell him to take walks, look at the beautiful Roman sunsets, the tramonto, to cure his jet lag.
Like he's a child.
Yeah, they treat this senior regional director, a man in his 30s, who has dedicated 20 years of his life to them, like a stressed-out toddler who just needs a nap and a snack.
They do this because if they engage with his arguments, they validate them. Since the system must remain perfect, the problem must reside entirely within him. He is just tired. When he finally forces the issue, when he asks directly, are we going to talk about the issues I wrote about in my letters? The director flatly says, no.
And when he pushes again?
When he pushes again, the director looks at him and says, textually, you're obsessed.
You're obsessed. They completely invalidate his intellect and his conscience in 2 words. But it gets so much darker. They send him to an internal priest doctor. Let's clarify this. Not an independent physician, but a doctor who is an official of the General Council, who answers to the very directors who are trying to silence him. And what does this doctor do?
He prescribes heavy psychiatric medication. He tells the Numerary to take a pill in the morning and a pill at night, and explicitly advises him not to pay much attention to the leaflet inside the box.
Because of course he does.
He tells him just to take the pills to help him rest and distance himself from problems.
And when he finally does read the leaflet after he escapes, what does he discover? Like, what were these pills?
He discovers a horrifying reality. The morning pill is a medication typically prescribed for severe depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and bulimia nervosa. The night pill is an anticonvulsant prescribed for clinical forms of epilepsy in infants and adults.
And he had none of those conditions.
He had absolutely none of these conditions. He was perfectly healthy, just morally distressed. From his perspective, the timing and the nature of these prescriptions felt like they were chemically medicating his dissent. The goal seemed to be to trap him in a chemical fog so he would stop asking questions and just comply.
It is pharmaceutical gaslighting. And Tapia's crisis, while different in its execution because it happened decades earlier, followed the exact same ideological logic. She was the regional director in Venezuela, and she started actively advocating for the mental and spiritual health of the women under her care. She pushed back against the male superiors, the conciliarios.
Let's define conciliarios. These are the Opus Dei priests who hold ultimate authority over the women's branch in a region. Tapia was demanding that the women have the freedom to confess to any Catholic priest they chose, rather than being forced to confess only to designated Opus Dei priests.
Why is that such a big deal? Why would that threaten them?
Because it threatens the centralized control of information. If the women confess their doubts, fears, and sins to outside priests, the institution loses its monopoly on their inner lives. The male superiors viewed Tapia's pastoral advocacy not as care for the women, but as dangerous insubordination. So they set a trap. She was suddenly recalled to Rome under the guise of a standard administrative meeting.
And the moment she crossed the threshold of Villa Sacchetti, the atmosphere was completely different. The members who picked her up were silent. And the very first thing they did was confiscate her passport. From that moment, she was effectively a prisoner in a foreign country.
She was isolated from the rest of the house, forbidden to speak to the women she had known and worked with for years. Her incoming and outgoing mail was intercepted and read. She was trapped within the very building she once helped run.
And then came the interrogations. She describes these grueling sessions where they continually demanded she confess to murmuration. What does that mean in their vocabulary?
Murmuration is the crime of speaking ill of the founder, the directors, or fracturing the unity of the organization. They wanted her to incriminate herself. They wanted her to formally admit that her attempts to secure basic freedoms for the women in Venezuela were actually acts of malicious rebellion.
Wow.
According to her memoir, they yelled at her, trying to break her down through exhaustion and repetition until she doubted her own memory and motives.
The comparative analysis here is what makes this so important. A spirituality that fears questions becomes a prison. In this machinery, dissent is always either moralized or pathologized.
Always.
If the institution is divinely perfect, structural critique is logically impossible. Therefore, the whistleblower must be fundamentally broken. For Tapia, she was framed as spiritually evil, guilty of murmuration, a rebel attempting to destroy the work. For the male Numerary, he was framed as mentally insane, obsessed, tired, and in need of epilepsy medication.
I want the listener to really consider the psychological toll of this. Imagine how terrifying it is to have your very sanity or your fundamental spiritual goodness aggressively questioned by the people you have trusted most in the world.
The people you gave your life to.
The people you've given your entire youth and adulthood to. It is designed to break you so completely that you surrender your conscience, accept their diagnosis, and submit back to the machine. You trade your internal compass for their absolute certainty.
But they didn't submit. And that is the triumph of this deep dive. Which brings us to the climax of both testimonies, how they physically and psychologically got out, and how the system immediately moved to erase their existence. Let's start with Tapia's escape. She is trapped in Rome, her passport confiscated. The interrogations culminate in a devastating final confrontation with Escrivá himself. He orders her to resign, and if she doesn't go quietly.
According to Tapia, Escrivá threatens to subject her to an internal ecclesiastical tribunal. He threatens to send a damning report to the Vatican full of entirely fabricated accusations of sexual deviancy to permanently and completely dishonor her name within the Catholic Church.
It's pure blackmail.
It is pure blackmail from the man she once believed was a living saint. She writes that she even feared they might physically drug her and commit her to a psychiatric asylum, a tactic she claimed had been used against others in the past.
So she realizes she has to get out physically, and she has to be incredibly careful. She takes this immense risk to dispose of any personal items they could twist against her. She literally throws the keys to her private P.O. box out a high window, praying they land in a neighbor's garden so the directors can't find them, and use whatever's inside to frame her.
And then comes the critical moment. She spots a telephone that has been momentarily left unguarded. In an environment where every move is monitored, this is her only window. She manages to smuggle a desperate, forbidding call to a journalist friend, Ismail Medina, who happened to be in Rome. She tells him she is in a life-threatening emergency and begs him to come to the building.
It's like a spy thriller.
It really is. His arrival at the gates, the threat of outside scrutiny and public scandal, is what finally forces the institution to let her physically walk out the door. She signs the dispensation papers under severe duress just to escape the building.
The male numerary's escape required a completely different kind of intervention, largely because he was under chemical sedation. He is flying back to his region after his time in Rome. He is confused, overwhelmed by the love bombing, taking these epilepsy and depression pills. But he writes that a tiny ray of light, a small voice in his conscience, is telling him, they've deceived you.
On that long flight, alone, he realizes they didn't let him talk, they called him obsessed, and they medicated him. He makes the definitive internal decision to leave.
But the programming is so deep that even after making that decision, he continues taking the pills for a few days.
He does.
He needs an external shock to fully sever the psychological cord. He takes a massive risk and goes to see a priest who is not an Opus Dei, a normal, outside diocesan Catholic priest who isn't part of the machinery.
Right, and he sits down and tells this outsider his entire story about Rome, the refusal to talk, the pills, and the priest gives him 3 pieces of immediate life-saving advice. First, stop taking the pills immediately. Read the leaflet. You are healthy.
Okay, what was the second?
Second, leave the organization. And third, don't lose your faith in God because of the actions of these men. The Numerary realizes that if he stays, he will literally go mad trying to deny reality, or he will lose his faith entirely by associating God with such cruelty.
So he turns their own bureaucracy against them. He writes 2 letters, one formal request for dispensation, and one blistering letter outlining exactly how they treated him just to ensure they process his exit as fast as possible to avoid a scandal. He turns down their offers of hush money, which they disguise as moving assistance, because he wants absolutely zero financial ties. He wants to be free to speak.
And then he packs his bags. After 20 years of total, unquestioning devotion, after holding the highest regional offices, he waits until midnight. He sneaks out of the center in the dark, trying not to make a sound, lugging his bags into a waiting taxi. He leaves like a thief in the night, just to reclaim his own autonomy and avoid a confrontation with the people he lived with.
And the final severing of his legal tie to the institution. It doesn't happen in a grand cathedral. It doesn't happen with a pastoral blessing. Weeks later, he meets a director to receive his verbal dispensation. And where do they meet? At a McDonald's. Over fast food.
It's so absurd.
In the most mundane, transactional setting possible, he is told he is no longer in the work. It is the ultimate demystification of the grand divine facade.
It reduces 20 years of agonizing sacrifice to a fast food transaction. But walking out of that McDonald's into the real world is where we have to talk about damnatio memoria, the weaponization of silence. Because in a high-control group, leaving is not the end of the punishment.
Not at all. Leaving becomes dangerous, and the primary goal of the institution post-departure is to preserve its own flawless image. The system must immediately erase departed members from the historical record and from the minds of the people still inside. They must become non-persons.
The Numerary found out that the remaining members were strictly forbidden from asking about where he went. His friends were told he was just resting somewhere, implying he was sick or exhausted. They pathologized his departure so the people inside wouldn't realize a senior director left over a crisis of conscience. They protect the institution by blaming the individual's mind.
But the erasure goes far beyond the internal walls. And Tapia's aftermath is a terrifying demonstration of institutional vindictiveness. When she finally got out and tried to rebuild her shattered life, she secured a job at a highly prestigious law firm in Spain.
And what did they do?
According to her documented accounts, Opus Dei actively tracked her down. They sent official letters directly to her new secular employers, claiming she had led a life of horrendous depravity. They were actively attempting to ruin her secular career, to poison her reputation, and essentially starve her out. The message was clear: if you leave us, you will not survive in the world.
And the most profound display of this power involved the highest levels of the Catholic Church itself. Decades later, during the beatification tribunal for Escrivá to make him a saint, Tapia wanted to testify. She wanted to provide a balanced, truthful view of the man's behavior, including the abusive tactics she witnessed.
And Opus Dei marshaled all their resources to control the narrative. Tapia states they formally lied to the Vatican tribunal. They claim she was part of an organized, malicious, defamatory campaign, and that she had helped prepare a hostile television program, which she emphatically states she absolutely did not do.
But the lie worked.
It thoroughly discredited her in the eyes of the Vatican judges, ensuring that the tribunal only heard the positive, carefully sanitized, deeply loyal testimonies provided by Escrivá's hand-picked successors. It shows that in these environments, objective truth is entirely subordinate to power, optics, and institutional survival.
And for the male Numerary, the aftermath involved the institution trying to delay his dispensation paperwork to maintain leverage. And in the most bizarre twist of gaslighting, the very Roman director who had called him obsessed, who refused to let him speak, and who facilitated his medical sedation with epilepsy pills, later emailed him a cheery Merry Christmas message.
You're kidding.
He acted as if they were old friends and no psychological torture had ever occurred. The Numerary just replied, "Thank you," and moved on with his life, realizing how pitiful the whole facade was.
Both Tapia and the Numerary walked away completely stripped. Tapia lost 18 years, her career, her savings, her identity. The Numerary lost 20 years, his youth, his professional trajectory, and left with absolutely no money. Yet despite losing everything materially, both of them found something infinitely more valuable on the other side of those heavy doors.
They found their own minds. They reclaimed their conscience. And that brings us to our reflective synthesis. We promised at the beginning of this deep dive that we would look at these two completely different lives and extract the shared architecture of the machinery that captured them.
To synthesize everything we've discussed, we can look at the mechanisms of this machinery in three core pillars. The first pillar is the capture of identity. Vocation becomes identity. The institution doesn't just want your time, it replaces your personal desires, your intellect, and your relationships with its own goals. Your professional work and every cent of your money are redirected to fuel the system.
The second pillar is the control of reality. Obedience becomes reflex. Your conscience is outsourced to the director, and institutional needs always override personal life. The system actively weakens family bonds, so it becomes your sole emotional provider, and it strictly controls information, whether it's tearing pages out of magazines or dictating who you can confess to, maintaining a monopoly on your reality.
And the third pillar is the erasure of the individual. Dissent is always moralized or pathologized. If you question the system, you're either evil or insane. This makes leaving extremely dangerous. And once you do leave, the institution preserves its innocence through damnatio memoriae, erasing you from history, lying about why you left, and protecting the narrative of their own divine perfection at all costs.
But the crucial final point, the light at the end of the tunnel for both of them, is that recovery begins when the conscience is trusted again. The ultimate tragedy here isn't just the lost years or the stolen money, it's the weaponization of pure intentions.
Yeah.
These were highly idealistic, intelligent people who desperately wanted to do good in the world, who wanted to serve God. And the system exploited that exact beautiful desire to turn them into compliant cogs.
But there is profound hope in these testimonies, because despite the absolute control, despite the immense wealth, the global reach, and the relentless psychological manipulation, the system failed to completely destroy them. The system did not need locked doors, it had built dependence. Yet both Tapia and the male Numerary found the strength to break that dependence. They shattered the illusion from the inside.
Because freedom is not a sin. When they finally spoke out, when they wrote these incredible testimonies, they didn't do it out of vindictiveness or petty resentment, no matter what the institution claims. They did it out of a desperate human need for truth. They did it so no one else would have to endure what they did. Testimony is not revenge. It is restoration. It is reclaiming the narrative.
And that is exactly why we study their lives. That is why we dedicate this time to unpacking these heavy texts. They were not rebels trying to destroy faith. They were witnesses. They were witnesses to the truth of what happens when faith is captured by power.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think about the architecture of your own life. Think about the spaces you inhabit, your workplace, your religious community, your social circles, your digital spaces. When you stand up and raise a valid, critical question about how things are operating, how are you treated?
Are you met with genuine, open dialogue?
Or are you immediately told that you are the problem? Are you isolated, silenced, pathologized, or told that you're just obsessed? Remember, the ultimate safeguard against any form of institutional capture isn't rebellion. It's a fiercely protected, well-formed conscience. Don't ever outsource your inner voice.
Because when the facade of the building looks impenetrable and perfect from the outside, the only way to know if it's truly safe is to trust the people who have been down in the basement, who have seen the foundation, and who managed to walk back out into the light.
That's right.
Thank you so much for joining us on this profound deep dive into Voices After Silence. We'll see you next time. Keep asking questions. Keep trusting your conscience. Take care.
Goodbye, everyone.
Lessons on the center line. Count my losses in the passing pines. If every wrong turn still somehow led me here to you, guess I can't complain when I look back through this back road rear view. First scar on my knuckle from a fight that proved nothing.